Sallu alayhi wa alihi, sallu alayhi wa alihi, sallu alayhi wa alihi, sallu alayhi wa alihi.
I'd like to welcome our special guest for today, Sidi Mustafa Majzub. He's at the moment in England, and he, as I told you all, he's a student of Dr. Lings, and in fact, he also assisted Dr. Lings on his masterpiece on the Quranic calligraphy and illumination, on the art of Quranic calligraphy and illumination. The second edition, or the new revised edition, which came out as one of the last books by Sheikh Bakr. So that's also a very, very special connection that Sidi Mustafa has with Sheikh Bakr. So I think we can start with you, and after you've spoken, we'll ask the participants to sum up their the experience of this reading circle and their comments on the book. Yeah. Although they've done that before also, but it will be nice to conclude concluding sentences from everybody at the end. Bismillah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Bismillah. Thank you for inviting me to talk. When you first asked me if I could have anything to mention on the book, I thought, well, there's nothing I have really to add. I mean, but then when I did think about it, there were 2 or 3 little anecdotes that come to mind, which I thought might be useful as an addition to your discussions. And also, Sidi Taimoor, please feel free to sort of join me in conversation in a way to try and sort of prompt me to remember things. But the main little anecdote that I thought might be interesting for you is Sidi Bakr did mention to me once how he would write the book, and he said he would write in the mornings, and he would spend most of the morning writing, and then the following day he would revise his work that he'd written the previous day, and then he would read through. And he said he quite often would find himself deleting nearly everything that he'd written, barring 1 or 2 sentences. So I had this image in my mind of the work being written really very painstakingly and very, very carefully. And you know, one of the things I would say about Martin Lings, first and foremost, is his poetic nature. I would say his first calling, in a certain sense, is poetry. And as a young man, he gave a wonderful lecture once when he was first up at Oxford. He wasn't really practicing his in a sort of formal religious way, and he used this wonderful expression. He said, by the time I was at university, me and my friend Adrian Patterson, who became a very good friend of his as well at Magdalen College, he said, I realized looking back, I'd made something of a religion of beauty for myself. And for him, you know, and that was the great, especially beauty in poetry and language. So, and in fact, he and his friend both decided to switch from their subjects and to ask the college to allow them to transfer to study English with C.S. Lewis. And that became the beginning of a great friendship between them. So, so this aspect of Sheikh Bakr's mastery of the English language, and the fact that he was really a poet first and foremost. I mean, you know, he has a corpus of his poetic writings, which is just simply called the collected poems. The first few poems in there are written in his 20s, early 20s. I think the first one was only about 23 or something like that. And you know, not only did he have a great command of the English language and a feel for the English language, he also studied it and taught it. So he studied under this great teacher, C.S. Lewis, and he then, Providence took him to Cairo where he was stuck during the war, and he ended up staying there teaching. Well, if I even I think he left in 52. So basically, from just before the war all the way to about 52, he was there. And after the war, his main work was at Cairo University, where he was teaching English. And there was a great annual event that used to take place in Cairo at the opera, where Martin Lings' students would put on every year a Shakespeare play. And Martin Lings said actually the Orientals in some ways play Shakespeare more magnificently than the English, because they have a sort of natural sense of dignity, let's say. So if you take, and of course, and later on, Martin Lings wrote his great book on Shakespeare. It's called The Secret of Shakespeare. And if I remember correctly, once when we were on a walk together, he said to me something like, "Astaghfirullah, but I almost feel that my book on Shakespeare is one of my favorite books that I've written." Even though it's a more sort of secular subject than some of his other things. Well, actually, it's not so secular, because it's really about the sort of spiritual message in the later Shakespeare plays. So is that a sort of background to his language and his great ability to write and compose English, this high English language? That's a very striking feature of this book, because I really don't think anybody else, irrespective of their studying and knowledge of the Islamic sort of history and so on, could have composed a book like this. Because if you notice where the language is spoken, where you have the characters, the Prophet ﷺ speaking or saying something and the companions replying, anhum, there's this wonderful language, and you just slip into it so easily. I think if anybody else had tried to write this sort of Shakespearean high English, they would never have been able to sort of pull it off. And at the same time, I think if you wrote the dialogue in normal English translation, as the hadith are usually translated and so on, really the language doesn't bear the sense of grandeur and gravitas that I think dialogue between the companions might have, you're sort of drawn into the high language of classical Arabic. So I think, and of course there again, Martin Lings has this wonderful command of Arabic language. I mean, he translated not only from Arabic, and he read through, of course, enormous amounts of Arabic in his study of the texts. But he had a great command of Arabic even in translating poetry and such forth. So and such like. Well, my own command of language isn't as good as his. I'm saying such forth. I don't think such a word exists, maybe. So that's one aspect I wanted to mention about the book, particularly. And of course, above all, I think, and I think you most probably mentioned this already yourselves before when talking, and Taimoor, I think you mentioned to me earlier that you knew about this aspect, but Martin Lings did mention particularly that he felt that the Prophet ﷺ was helping him in his work. He felt a sort of presence of a sort of guidance as he was working. It's not a subject that I think he would have really chosen for himself. I think in his own sheikh, I think, was maybe surprised that he'd chosen this as a topic. I think he might have expected him more to, write more sort of directly on this other subjects of tasawwuf, maybe. But my impression was that he was approached by one of the, I think it's Allen and Unwin, who are a great publishing house. So I think he was approached to try and write a life of the Prophet. But I think he was reluctant at first, thinking, well, there's plenty of things out there. But I think when he looked through the English Seerahs and saw what was available, he realized that they really were quite lacking. And of course, some of it is through Oriental scholarship that in a way needs sort of rebalancing. And not all biographies are written with a sort of sympathetic outlook or somebody from within. So And if one thinks of Sufism as, in a certain sense, representing the core of the Islamic universe, it's not only written from within, but from the heart of Islam. So there's something very special about this book. Of course, I can think of many people who've been affected by it enormously. There was a fakira in our order who said to me once, I read a few pages of the book every day, and when I get to the end, I start at the beginning again. I mean, so she would simply live years at a time, just simply going backwards and forwards through the life of the Prophet and sort of, so to speak, living with the companions. I remember his one little comment of his as well was, he said, I never imagined when I started on this project that I would end up having to research the number of horses that were used at a particular battle, or, you know, so he had to plunge into all this sort of detail. But of course, you know, a lot of that isn't in the book, but he has to sort of sift through that. And another gift I would say that now it just occurs to me that Martin Lings had was his sort of sense of genealogy. He was masterful at knowing who's related to whom, and so you know, that Islamic milieu in you know, that early setting is really quite complex. The relationships between people, you know, and you know, the different family genealogies, and also the tribal affiliations, and which tensions existed with different tribes, and where different tribal boundaries and zones existed. For Sidi Abu Bakr, he's masterful at something like that, because, I mean, anybody else, you could read through the entire Islamic early literature and you wouldn't be able to place things properly because you'd miss little details, or you'd confuse one name with another name. But Martin Lings had this wonderful capacity to be able to keep all this information, this sort of genealogical branching of information, very clearly in his mind, clearly. I mean, and he makes it so easy. I think that's one of his greatest gifts. He would make complicated subjects very accessible, and he would always sort of distill things down to their simplest core. And you'd think, oh, well, I could understand this, and I could have written a book as simply as this myself, you know. So, you see what I mean? But so that was one point, particularly around his language, let's say, and how he came to write the book. But the other little anecdote I want to tell you about, which is quite interesting, is there was a second edition of the book that had to be produced, a particular edition. I remember sometime in the 90s, I think it was, late 90s. I remember the Islamic Text Society, they decided they'd better produce a special edition of the life of the Prophet for Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia, in their great wisdom, had decided to ban the book because of its sort of unacceptable content. And then, as you know, of course, the Wahhabis are really quite an extraordinary branch of Islam. I mean, there's no amount of complaints that one can have against a certain sort of they sort of dismiss all sorts of learning and the different madhahib and so on. So there was once actually one criticism I did hear Martin Lings make about the Wahhabi outlook was the Wahhabis are very well intentioned, and of course they're good Muslims. You know, they believe in the Prophet, they follow his book, and but Wahhabism is a bit like it's like they're trying to defend the city of Islam, this great city. They're all at the door of La ilaha illallah. We will not let anyone break this door down. We were staunch defenders. But they forget that the city has many other gates, and they've left them all wide open for the enemy to just walk in. They're defending the gate at the rock. The only gate of La ilaha illallah is the gate they're defending, and letting the other gates in. So, of course, the Wahhabis, like, for instance, they would ban the books of Imam Ghazali, you know, who's generally accepted as one of the great authorities of Islam. So it's not surprising they'd also ban Martin Lings's book. But they mentioned that the reasons they banned it were they mentioned two items that made the book unacceptable. One of them was that Sidi Abu Bakr had mentioned the detail that's mentioned in the earliest of the sources, that the Prophet ﷺ, when Mecca was taken and the Prophet went into the Kaaba and asked for all the sort of idolatrous content to be removed, he placed his hands on two of the icons and said, but not these. And one of them, I think, was of Sayyidina, an icon of Sayyidina Ibrahim, representing Sayyidina Ibrahim, and the other one was, I think, the Virgin and Child, alayhim as-salam. And so that to the Wahhabis was unpalatable. This is nonsense. It can't be included in a book on the Prophet's lives, even though it comes from the Islamic tradition and the Islamic sources. And in fact, interesting is that I think the one forgets that the subtitle of the book is his life based on the earliest sources. So Sidi Abu Bakr was careful to sort of avoid the accusation that his material was actually later fables, which were then so he went to the very earliest sources and studied there and brought his information from there. So the Wahhabis, since they found it uncomfortable, they simply dismissed that early source because it doesn't fit their way of thinking. And the other point that the Wahhabis didn't like was the fact that the account of the Prophet's marriage with Sayyidatna Zainab, I think the wife of I think it's the wife of Zayd ibn Haritha, is so I mean Zayd was effectively like a son to him, and I think it's I was trying to, have you read that section yourselves in your readings in the last week, Sidi Taimoor? I don't know if you can hear me there.
Yeah.
Oh no, but yes, I couldn't find the passage in the book. I was just quickly looking through, but if I remember correctly, the Prophet ﷺ had come to visit Zayd at his home, and his wife had opened the door, and the Prophet had then turned away from her, saying something like, Ya lil musarrif al qulub, to he who dispenses men's hearts. So she had the impression that he'd been moved by seeing her, and anyway, the outcome of it was that the Prophet was given dispensation from heaven that he should marry her, and Zayd had said to the Prophet, I should divorce my wife for you to marry her, and then he'd said, no, you shouldn't do that. You should stay married to your wife, of course. But then there was a Quranic revelation that actually married the Prophet to his wife, and I think it's in the same context that the Quran also mentions that you can't give your own name to an adopted son. So I think from that time on, I think is when Sayyidina Zayd had his, because I think up till then he'd been called Zayd ibn Muhammad, who had adopted him. So anyway, so these two topics were distasteful to the Wahhabi regime, and so they had banned the book. So Sidi Abu Bakr had thought that, well, for the sake of those two small incidents in aspects of the story, and it seems a pity for that whole book to be banned just for those two little sections. so he chose to sort of remove them from the text and rewrite the sections where they'd been taken out. And there was a special new edition of the book. And I remember the new edition came out with a green cover. And I think the recent editions are all green, as far as I remember. The editions originally had a blue cover. Actually, I've got a hardback blue copy. I don't know if your copies are blue or green, but oh yes, that's that green cover that began with that new edition for Arabia, exactly. So the new green edition came out. Sidi Awak looked at it and realized that the printers had made a mistake, and they'd republished, so many thousand copies that were going to be sent to Arabia of the earlier text and not the new adjusted text. So he took that as a sign that he shouldn't have made the deletion. So it was like a sort of providential mistake. So the abridged version was never actually distributed, as it happens.
That's a wonderful story.
So
I forgot. I remember hearing this, but I'd completely forgotten.
Yeah.
That's quite wonderful.
But I think he was using maybe the precedent of his own sheikh, who had been, the sheikh wrote a book called The Language of the Self, and it was dedicated to the Jagat Guru in India, and that book is difficult to get hold of, and one of the friends of the sheikh had pestered him to republish that in India. But the friend who'd been asking for that while they were pestering for that, they were actually saying, but please could we remove the sections that are sort of disparaging, let's say, or sort of don't talk very positively of Vivekananda. And the sheikh hadn't really approved of that idea, but he was pestered a little bit on that point, and he came to the conclusion that on balance it would be better to take those out and let a new edition to exist. So I think he was using that precedent in a way. So it's worth knowing that if you ever come across an edition of The Language of the Self, you want to work out if it's the original edition of that followed the original Sheikh's format, or if it's an Indian edition which has some expurgations. So that's what other things come to mind. I wrote a little note.
And thank you very much for that. And in the meantime, we can go around with the participants. And if you remember anything else, you can then add it at the end.
Yes. No, I think that's pretty much everything I wanted to mention, really.
That's quite wonderful. I hadn't mentioned that Sheikh Bakr felt that the help of the Prophet was with him when he was writing. I hadn't mentioned that before. So that's wonderful to hear.
Mm-hmm.
So who would like to give their sort of closing remarks on this circle of reading? Rabia, would you like to start?
I don't mind, लेकिन कामिल साहब भी हैं. कामिल साहब अगर शुरू करना चाहें.
We'll ask him at the end, I guess.
अच्छा, okay, ठीक है. I mean इतनी बड़ी बातें हो रही हैं, so I don't think I have anything very wise to say, except that all this just makes one come back to the fact that anything written with or through a source of nur, let's say, it comes through in the text, and the experience of reading something like that also therefore touches the heart, and it's not just an intellectual kind of what can I say, it's not just intellectually enriching, but it actually touches the heart and it moves the heart. And I'm sure that wherever the book has gone, it has actually moved hearts, and it's actually probably strengthened the faith of the people who have had the experience of reading it. So वही वाली बात है कि knowledge which comes with nur versus just knowledge which is intellectual. So just because a wali has written the book, that's the main sort of quality, I would say. Thank you. That's it. All I wanted to say.
Beautiful.
Beautiful
Wow.
comment.
We've all noticed that special barakah even in this reading circle. It is really, I think you've put it very nicely into words. फारूक साहब आप कुछ कहना चाहेंगे?
आपको आवाज आ रही है मेरी?
जी.
Okay. First of all, I like to say that this book has inspired me ever since I was like 25 years old. And this was the book that brought me, first of all, I came to know for the first time who Martin Lings is, and he's a Muslim. And I was fortunate enough to then, through this book, I came to know him. And I was fortunate to attend one of his lectures in Academy Lahore. And that was a very wonderful thing. I knew no one who was around him. Yeah, I think Sidi Raza Shah Kazmi was with him, and Suhail Umar Sahab was with him. But at that time, I knew no one. And through this book, I came to the life of the Prophet, and I noticed that this book has something very special about it. This has been written from a point of view from which I couldn't find in any other Seerah book. They're all good in their own ways, but they never appealed to me in this manner. I remember another book was issued to us, a very book with multiple volumes by Shibli Nawani Sahab. That book couldn't have that kind of impact on me like this book. So I came to know that he has this group and everything, and other books which are being printed by Suhail Academy, and it opened up a whole new world to me. So I want to thank all of you, Hast and Neest, for bringing me back once again to the fragrance of this book once again, especially in these Rabiul Awwal 10-12 days, and for you because you've arranged it, and thank you very much to Kamil Saab. He is, whenever he said anything, although he says very less, but whenever he says something, it's always very inspiring. And thank you very much to our guest, Mustafa Majzub. Thank you very much for coming and joining us. And it was very, very interesting and inspiring to learn what all was happening when he was writing this book, and especially this thing about the Saudi Arab version of the book, which never came into being actually.
So it was, thank you for being a part of this reading circle. I think we should organize more such reading circles.
Yeah.
Because each time each person has brought a different angle or some different takeaway. So we've been quite blessed in that manner. Yeah.
In fact, I could mention one thing that comes to mind is that there was an audio version done of this book during Sidi Awbak's life, sort of like a commercial reading, and it was with a sort of a professional reader of some kind, and it was organized, I don't know, but Sidi Awbak did give the permission, because he was told that, you know, it's a commercial issue, but one can't do the whole book, but it could be sort of abridged, and one could have an abridged version of the book. I must say, I listened to some of that abridgment, and I remember thinking, oh, if only we could have asked Martin Lings to read the book himself, because really he would have been the best voice, and the English voice that's reading it really isn't up to the grandeur, I don't think, especially when one can imagine Martin Lings's own voice. But the other thing I would say is that abridgment, to my mind, was actually rather a mistake, because you realize that the whole book being so carefully written and so carefully balanced, almost like sentence by sentence, you can't really take out, you can't have a professional abridger remove things, because you actually get a different impression of, if you don't know about the background, and you don't know, you tend to get much more. I mean, for instance, I remember feeling after the abridgment that there's much more in this book that I remember about the Prophet's wives and his marriages, and so on and so forth. And all sorts of little details seem to be out of balance because of the abridgment. So I think that's it's not a wonderful final point to be making on the book, but it's worth noting that the book in its original form has such a perfect balance. Also, I should actually, on a more positive note to end, the Sheikh, Sheikh Abu Bakr's own Sheikh, actually did mention to him some years after he'd written the book, I think after being possibly a little bit surprised at the topic, but when he read it himself, he actually did mention to him something about that he did feel it was a great work. That it was a kind of masterpiece. So
that's also precious. राबिया, आपने अपना माइक खोला था, आप कुछ कहने वाली थी?
नहीं, मैं आपसे एग्री कर रही थी जो आप कह रहे थे कि इस तरह के रीडिंग साइकिल्स होने चाहिए, तो I would agree with that.
चलो, इंशाल्लाह we should plan more.
जी, इंशाल्लाह.
Meher, would you like to add anything as a concluding remark, so to speak?
जी, अस्सलाम वालेकुम व रहमतुल्लाह. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala ali Muhammad. There are many things. I think this particular group is really special. The month is special. The author is special. This book, who the book is about is the most special. So I feel like Sarah, all of this reaches us now in this way. So I was drawn to something, like whenever we're reading something, what's everything else around us also starts to take that color if it's coming from a pure source. So I was at a gathering, a milad yesterday. There was much praise of the Prophet ﷺ, and this one verse for me, this is a lot of this has been about this deep connection with Quran that this particular book has. Like, I think it makes it come, or sort of ties the life of the Prophet so deeply with the Word of God. So there was this verse from the Quran that I was that came my way, in the sense that I think Josko it really I feel this book gave to me as a sense of Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, and what the relationship that the author seems to have with the subject that he's writing about. So this entire, it's not just a narrative everyone's spoken about, the language, and then the world of knowledge that the author has within him, which comes through in this story. So yeah, it's the same with us. I feel like our understanding of Deen, also from this story about the Saudi version, and, the problems that one can have with the truth, and the purity of it, and how we try to control it. So ye hai Surat At-Tawbah, and it says, certainly has come to you a messenger from yourselves. And then it says, Azizun alayhi, grievous to him, ma anittum harisun, this word of this haris, that he is concerned, alaykum, about you, bil mu'minina raufur rahim, and to the believers, he is kind and merciful. So this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala intended for us till the end of time, through the shakhsiyat, the person of Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. It's so beautiful to realize this through the works of the people, like Martin Lings. I don't know if I made sense or not. Anyway,
No,
so that's what I would like to say, and I would say thank you. This was beautiful. और ये reading circle वाली बात बिल्कुल है, बिल्कुल बिल्कुल दुरुस्त है. I feel कि हमें बिल्कुल भी नहीं रोकना चाहिए. It should continue. Sorry if I switched to Urdu in the middle, but yes. And everyone's words are with me. Whatever has been spoken of in these days, it's really everything was relevant. What was read at which time, and whoever read it. Subhanallah. So yes, thank you.
and thank you for your views on that verse. That's beautiful. From Surah Tawbah. Sahar, would you like to say anything?
जी बिल्कुल. अस्सलाम वालेकुम. First of all, I would like to thank Hastonis that you हम बचपन से from my childhood I've been attending Milad and singing devotional songs about our prophet, but never ever actually came to know the actual happenings and actual incidents of his life before reading this book or before this and the book itself was quite good. लेकिन जितना हस्तनीस ने इसको life बख्शी है and especially our Justin Majzub साहब ने, that it's just come to life for me. मुझे अपने college days और literature की classes याद आ गई हैं जिसमें हम dissect करते थे novels को और poetry को. So just like that we have actually, sorry to say it's a bad word, but we have dissected this book. तो उससे मुझे इतना वो मजा आया और इतना ज्यादा इंटरेस्ट पैदा हुआ. पहले मैं चैप्टर अ डे पढ़ती थी और इसकी वजह yesterday looking for the right excerpt, तो मैंने तकरीबन आधी बुक पढ़ डाली और हस्तोनी इसकी वजह से मैं स्पीड अप हो गई. तो अल्लाह का बहुत शुक्र, आप लोगों का बहुत थैंक यू फॉर इंट्रोड्यूसिंग. और दूसरा मैं ये व्हाट आई how I admire Martin Lings for कि हमें हजूर सल्लल्लाहु अलैहि वसल्लम was there 14 centuries back and none of us have met him. और मतलब मार्टिन लिंग्स जिन्होंने बुक पूरी लिख डाली, ही उनके पास सिर्फ सोर्सेज हैं और सोर्सेज भी अर्लीस्ट और बहुत मतलब कोई उनको ऐसा उनकी लाइफ स्टोरी तो नहीं बता रहा, सिर्फ डिफरेंट इंसिडेंट्स फ्रॉम हिज लाइफ. तो उनको इस तरह कोऑर्डिनेट करना आपस में, इस तरह वो जैसे कह रहे वर्ड यूज करे थे, बैलेंस करना उनको इंसिडेंट्स को कि वो बिल्कुल एक स्टोरी लगे ऑफ हिज डे टू डे लाइफ ऑलमोस्ट. और इतनी वो कोहेरेंटली वो सब कुछ एक के बाद दूसरा वाकया और उन सब के उसको टाइमलाइन में लाना, उन डिफरेंट वाकयात को. और फिर कुरान से वही जैसे मेहर कह रही हैं कि कुरान से एडजस्ट कि कुरान भी होल्ड्स अ न्यू मीनिंग फॉर अस आफ्टर दिस, ये जो उनकी लाइफ से कोऑर्डिनेट किया है. तो ये कितना माशाल्लाह ये मैजिकल और वही पेंस्टेकिंग काम होगा कि सब कुछ उनके सारे वो नाउजुबिल्लाह कहना नहीं चाहिए कि बिखरे हुए एक्सर्प्ट्स को इकट्ठा करना. आई थिंक दैट्स अ ग्रेट जॉब. उस जो हमें कहीं से और 14 सेंचुरीज पहले के बारे में एक पूरी स्टोरी ट्रू टू लाइफ बनाना और इतनी रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी से बनाना कि उसमें कुछ गलत या कुछ ऐसा ना पार्ट आ जाए जो खुदा ना खास्ता जो फॉर्निकेशन हुई है. तो वो आई थिंक दैट्स एडमिरेबल.
Thank you
so
sir.
much.
Wonderful comments. But what sort of one small sort of aspect I would like to highlight is that the main oldest sort of Seerah of Ibn Ishaq, that is chronological. So it's not that the sources were all mixed up, but there was a narrative. But I just wanted to add that.
यही अच्छी बात आपने की. मुझे पता नहीं था, मुझे ये लगता था कि सिर्फ पार्ट्स मिलते होंगे और उनको इकट्ठा करना होता है.
हाँ, ये उस तरह से these are not canonical, but they are maghazi, यानी कि they given different names, and there's one is the Seerah ibn Ishaq, and so on. So there are, as the book says, the earliest sources. But just then to pull them all together, then coordinate them with the Quran, it is, as you're saying, magical and masterful, no doubt about that. And thank you for your comments. I think this group is also fortuitous, or it's not exactly providential that we had a wonderful group. And I'm sad that Waleed is missing today. He adds a certain life into it, which is special. An enthusiasm. Let's see who's left. Michelle, आप कुछ कहना चाहेंगी?
Just firstly, thank you for today's discussion, of course, and for this entire week. It really has been a blessing, and I agree. We definitely, please, should have more of these readings. This book or any more of Sheikh Abu Bakr's books that I was looking at here, list. I really want to read the others now. And also, like for me personally, I feel like we've been introduced to these narrations in the Seerah a lot through our schooling, which is oriented towards a certain way of thinking. And it's always separated Quran and Allah from Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. And I feel like this book, and just generally, I think life at this point, is bridging that gap. And this book has done it beautifully. There is no separation. There is no this or the other. It's just one. And the way he puts them both together is just, it's amazing how it erases all the bias that has been put in us through our, conventional schooling in a matter of a few days. I think that's the biggest impact this book has had for me. So thank you for that.
Thank you for those comments. In the end, Izza, आप कुछ कहना चाहेंगी?
Yes, thank you so much for to everyone who is involved in this. And this was I joined a little late, but it was very exciting for me. And I think Michelle pretty much summed up what I wanted to say. The first time I read this book was when I was 16. And back then it was very fascinating to understand that someone could write about the life of the Prophet in such a way with such a different expression, perspective. So it really opened my eyes, and it felt like his life seemed more accessible. So I'm very grateful for the existence of this book and to everyone who discussed it. Thank you.
Thank you, Izza. Kamil Sahab, would you like to say some concluding remarks?
Well, I think, mashallah, everyone has really summed up their impressions and responses, and reflect really how the whole, all of us have been affected and moved by the book. Particularly, I'm very glad Sidi Mustafa was able to take us still closer to the author, Sheikh Abu Bakr, with his very intimate time that he's fortunate to spend with him under his guidance. There's just one thing that has come to my mind while I was, a number of you remarked in passing, is your mention of the Quran, especially how it comes to life in this book when it's like almost inseparable from the life of the Prophet ﷺ. And just as we all feel that scholarship, fine, that's all right and essential, and there have been no dearth of some wonderful scholarly writings on the Seerah, as well as very good translations of the Quran. But it seems to me, and I think you would all agree, that wouldn't it be lovely if we could have a similar reading on the material that Sheikh Abu Bakr has translated from the Quran, I mean, his translations of the Quran. And I wonder if Sidi Mustafa could throw some light on, it's woven right through this particular book, And of course, many of Sheikh Abu Bakr's other writings, particularly the book on certainty, etc., which I understand was originally written in Arabic.
Yes.
So, so as you said, Sheikh Abu Bakr combines the highest scholarship, a depth of understanding of both the Arabic language and the English language, and like who was it saying that the scattered pieces should be brought together. Would it be possible, Sidi Mustafa, to collect the scattered translations?
Yes. Oh, but it's a wonderful thing you're mentioning. You know, I have actually seen a book that does collect these scattered elements. I think Sidi Said in our order had actually worked on it, but I can't remember who's published it. It might be in Fons Vitae, or but I have seen that, and interestingly enough, I remember seeing that there are several. Sidi Abu Bakr would often translate the same verse in slightly different ways in different places where he's quoted it. So you actually have sort of different versions of his own translations of the same verse as well. But it has been done. But I don't have a copy of that book, but I have seen it somewhere. And I think it sort of came out maybe in the early noughties or the late 90s, something like that. But that does kind of lead me on to another little sort of topic in a certain sense, which was for years, various people would approach Martin Lings and say to him, and of course, you're the person who should be translating also the Quran. And he would sort of like throw up his arms and say, of course not. I mean, there's plenty of perfectly adequate translations. And he mentioned, of course, above all, the Pickthall translation. In fact, you may be interested to know that I can't remember. It's like I seem to remember mentioning he would read like one juz or something of the Quran every month or so. I can't remember the exact ratio he mentioned, but I think that he would read through the Quran, 2 or 3 times a year. That was my impression. But Sidi Farad and I, when we were working on the Quran project with him, every so often would sort of dare to broach the subject of him translating the Quran again. And this went on several times. And on one occasion, he said, now, no one's to ask me about that again. I don't want to be pestered with that. I've got other things that are more important. But then on one occasion, he said, en passant, he said to me, well, since I do read through the Quran so regularly, and I read through my Pickthall translation, which has the Arabic and the English side by side, if I had the Pickthall translation but with large margins, I could, as I'm reading through, maybe make some changes, because there's not much would need to be changed in the Pickthall translation. I think one of the things that he particularly didn't like about the Pickthall translation, almost one of the few things he mentioned, was the translation of La ilaha illallah. There is no God other than Allah. And he said, that should be translated. There's no God, small g, other than God, a capital G, because that's a perfectly adequate translation as well, because otherwise it limits it to sort of like an Islamic context, whereas the Quran clearly has this sort of universalist aspect. But anyway, so what I did once I heard that, and knowing that Sidi Farad and myself, we'd been pestering him on and off, not relentlessly, but we'd mention it from time to time. So I went in and photocopied the Pickthall translation in 2 large volumes photocopied with very large margins. It was like an A3 copy. And I presented them to him. And he said to me, oh, well, now I have no excuse not to do it. So in fact, he did start working on that. And but Saudi Arabia, he used to joke that we can't have another book in the house. You can't give me a book as a gift, because Saudi Arabia, my wife, has told me that anything that comes in, I have to remove something else out because we have no space. And but of course, these two huge volumes that I presented him, he said, oh, I'll have to keep them in the garage, or something. There was some special place he had to put them in. But the curious thing is that I know that he'd been working on them, but after he passed away, Sidi Rida looked high and low, but we never found what he'd been working on. And I feel that's a tremendous loss to the English language, really, and especially, of course, to Islam in the English language. Maybe he decided that if it's incomplete, it shouldn't stay, or I don't know. It's a mystery what happened to those two large volumes that I imagine would have had some wonderful sort of annotations in the margins. But,
they may still be found one day. Let's hope.
You never know. But I would have thought they would have turned up by now. But
thank you. Did you want to add anything else?
Well, no, I can't think. The problem is, of course, one could talk endlessly about Sheikh Abu Bakr in a way. What one anecdote leads to the next. But that's what I can think.
I just wanted to mention another aspect, that for a few years, Sheikh Abu Bakr would travel from England towards the east as far as the Far East.
Yes, so Kuala Lumpur.
And quite a few times Sidi Mustafa would accompany him. And that's how we got to meet Sidi Mustafa in Lahore and had some wonderful time. So would you like to mention anything of those journeys? Because we have a couple of minutes to go.
Oh, my goodness.
Traveling with Sheikh Abu Bakr. What was he, in that sense?
Well, where to begin, really? Well, one thing I can mention to you is that I actually started on those journeys with him, coming further than Jeddah. I used to travel as far as Jeddah to accompany him. But one year I said to him, well, maybe I could accompany you, because we were at the airport in Jeddah and he was leaving, and I could see, he was carrying his bags. I was thinking somebody should carry his bags for him or help him. And so I made some sort of incidental comment saying maybe next year I could accompany you, some sort of rather sort of hushed tones. I was sort of mumbling most probably. And he said something like, oh, well, possibly. And during the course of the following year, that possibly became more and more certain in my mind. And towards the end of that year, I asked him, well, what's your itinerary? So he gave me his itinerary, and I thought, well, that must be confirmation that he's happy for me to come along with him. And the next thing I did was to announce to him that I was booked on all of his flights. And it was only later that I found out that he'd expressed some surprise to Sidi Rida that, I was actually on this journey with him. Anyway. So I ended up on the journey sort of by accident, so to speak. But then he was very graciously at the end of that first year together. He said, no, I said, of course, I misunderstood you, so I won't do that again. But he said, no, I've become quite used to being here, so please do it again. So I was blessed to have that.
Mashallah.
But in terms of, there's so many wonderful sort of golden moments on those journeys, especially, of course, meeting the companions that he'd have around the world, and having our prayers together and so on. But one of the wonderful things I should mention is that he insisted on, he didn't have much luggage. He didn't want to have a suitcase that he'd have to wait for and pick up and all of that palaver. So he simply made the decision to travel in Islamic dress. So when I accompanied him, I thought, well, I must do the same, and I must have my hands free to be of service to him. And I would say one of the greatest gifts I received from Martin Lings, in a roundabout sort of way, was the blessing of living in traditional clothes. Because I would set off on a journey with him and return, a couple of weeks later back to Cairo. And the entire time, I'm in my jalabiya and my abaya and my turban, and it just became a sort of natural part of my existence. And it was always sort of something uncomfortable about going back to Western clothes and realizing that there's this sort of disparity in one's own life. And Martin Lings would wear his own traditional clothes at home most of the time. And it was when he had occasion to do something else, he would put on Western clothes to sort of attend, or to go on walks in the countryside or so on. But it shows how important just that aspect of one's dress is. Of course, traveling with Martin Lings is such a barakah. And I should mention to those who don't know, I became Muslim more or less on the spot on meeting him. I'd met Muslims all my life, and I had all sorts of qualms about Islam and religions generally. I believed in God, but it was only when I met Martin Lings that I just suddenly realized, my goodness, this is real. And this man is a saint, clearly. And if he's a Muslim, I must follow him. But to be in his barakah and his presence, one felt that one was lifted above one's normal self. And in fact, I think that's listening to the friends talking about your readings, I'm sure you've experienced the same thing, because the written word is very much like being with the person. It's like a very intimate internal process, really. So you're sort of with Sidi Abu Bakr, listening to him speaking. So you're lifted up out of yourself, and you're given a sort of higher possibility of yourself. So I would say that's one of the great things, I would say, traveling with him. After those few days, you almost start imagining, I might be a sort of quite a spiritual person myself. But after you then part company with him and you're back home for a few days, you suddenly realize, no, that's an illusion. I was just bathed in his barakah. And it was just that he brought out the best in me and suppressed that in me that was. Anyway, so that's one aspect. But in terms of details, I would say there's one or two moments that stick in my mind. One a curious little detail you laugh about, because he was extremely humorous, Sidi Abu Bakr, as well as having his gravitas. But he could. And there's one wonderfully humorous moment I'll never forget. We were somewhere in an airport, and we entered into one of these large elevators to go down to some other floor. And, the doors of the elevator closed, and there we were in this silence, just ourselves together. And, we weren't speaking. And in the background, there was this sort of, just sort of piped music that was just sort of very, quietly going on in the background. And we were waiting. The elevator was taking a long time to go down. And then Sidi Abu Bakr just turned to me and said, "They call this easy listening." And it was just for me, just the most wonderful way to sum his humor up. And he always, with the simplest little detail, to be able to say such a, it's such a huge conversation that, the problems of the modern age, how could such sort of trivial music be piped into a mind that's God's created in his own image, so to speak, on earth? And how can you have to sort of confront this sort of dreadful ambience? But, he was dealing with it. And one almost felt apologetic when one was with Martin Lings. You'd see things that you realize, if I was walking on my own through the airport at this point, I most probably wouldn't notice this. But as soon as you're in his company, you realize, oh my goodness, look at this dreadful scene over here, or the so being in his company, one would see the ugliness, so to speak, and the paradoxes of the modern age we live in. But at the same time, one was very aware that the modern age also has its wonderful compensations, and somehow, having had the wonderful blessing of being in his company, you also saw that, he himself was one of the wonderful compensations for the age. There are occasional very bright, very transparent things that draw you to the truth in a sort of setting which is quite often very dark in the background. It's almost as if the world, the modern world, is like a sort of foil to sort of present him even brighter than you would normally be, let's say, in a different age.
Thank you, Sidi Mustafa. I mean, as they say that even the mention of the Salihin is ibadah. So great blessing hearing about Sheikh Bakr. But yes, Farooq Saab, then we'll wind up.
Yes, today is a special day because Mustafa Majzub Saab is here. One more question, please. You must have spent a lot of time with him, maybe a decade or more with the Lings. And you must have seen some changes in his personality, in his ways, in his the way he lived and behaved through the years. So as he aged, he must have changed at least a little bit. So can you tell us what kind of changes did you see in him as he aged and came into his last years and everything?
My first reaction to that is none whatsoever. I would say that the only possible change I would point to was in his the very last maybe few months of his life. There may be one or two moments where he'd forgotten some detail or some sort of related to old age, let's say. But even then, I would say in a sense as you're putting your finger on exactly what Sidi Bakr was by asking that question, because in a certain sense there was something impeccable about him and non-changing about him. If you met him incidentally, you'd think, oh, well, he might be different in 10 years. But in fact, he was almost always at the same unhurried pace. He was always as measured. He was always as careful with every detail. And I never saw that waver. There's something quite magical about that. Even on little details, like we'd often on a walk, the friends would come and visit him on a Sunday, and he on the return journey, he'd often want to go through the garden of his neighbor Reza Shah Kazemi and Sayyid Nureen. But every time he would come, if he was ahead of the rest of the troop, because he would always be ahead and we'd be following behind. There's never a time if he'd arrive at the gate and want to go through his garden where he wouldn't wait until Sidi Rida would catch up and then ask him, is it all right if we go through your garden? He'd never presumed that although he'd asked it 100 times, that on this occasion Sidi Rida might say, oh no, please don't go through my garden this time because I don't know, for some reason. There was something about him that was, and I think that sort of impeccability and that changelessness of him also somehow showed what he was within. He was like, there's this expression I've heard from him, Ibn al-Waqt, being in the moment. In a way, he was always in the same moment. And as a sort of spiritual master, in a way, his very personality and presence and his unchanging quality, in a way, was part of his teaching, I would say. But I should also add one or two other anecdotes in terms of our travels. But there's one thing that he once mentioned to me, actually, that he said once when he was at the Kaaba, a man saw him and just walked straight up to him and just took his hand, and beamed him into his face, and then they parted. They never spoke a word. It was simply, and you know, if I would be traveling with him again, often in the context of being at an airport, you'd see people walk past him as if, you know, oh, there's an old man who, you know, is walking with a younger man and they're just doing whatever. But then you'd see somebody at the other side of the airport catching sight of him, and simply by seeing his face would recognize who he was and would come up and want to greet him. And it's amazing how he would have that effect on people. And also he was wonderfully patient and extremely careful about certain sort of details. And I mean, I remember once we arrived, in fact, strangely enough, in Lahore, and there'd been a mistake about who was to pick him up at the airport. But it was wonderful being with him, and he was so patient, so unruffled, and so pragmatic about thinking. And I remember him saying, yes, I remember Sidi Kamil and the family. I'm sure I could find my way there because it's near Mian Mir Saab's tomb. So we could find out, if all else fails, we'll just find our way to Mian Mir Saab, and he'll be our guide to finding our way. You know, just little practical details like that. He would quite often remind me, I hope you've been to the ticket office to register your next flight. And in fact, he quite often looked after me for all the sort of mistakes that I would have made. And yes.
Yeah, I think we inshallah have a whole session with you on it. It's quite lovely.
Thank you.
No, I must go on, exactly.
So we'll end by thanking you once again. And Meher is also saying we should have a session with you regarding Sheikh Abu Bakr. So maybe we could at some point.
Thank you.
As-salam.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jazakallah.
Thank you.
Yes, I must. That's a really lifetime's work. I must sit down and actually properly write these anecdotes. Yes.
I think you should.
Yes, no, and there are various people who are asking me to do that, especially my mother, who's been pressing me to do it for some time.